Now, from experience, I know that this insert sits a little high, and it's probably swollen at some point in time from moisture. So what we're going to do, two things. We're going to...
Let's talk about this insert for a little bit. This is the classic red fiber insert. The red fiber insert used by McGregor, and it was used in some of the Spalding clubs too, wasn't it?
A lot of the clubs in those days. And it's basically paper with a resin in it.
It'd be the typical colors that we would see back
McGregor
then.
used a lot of the red. Of course, with the Imatics, they used the black and the white.
The black and the white, and sometimes the red and the white.
Exactly.
And with Spalding, we would see the black and white.
Typically, and they were vertical rather than horizontal.
Vertical, right.
While this is out, it's going to be a little high right here. I'll just put it on a sanding block.
Sand that down a little bit.
And if I really get to where I want to get at it quickly, I go to the belt sander and turn that on and do it on there. Or I'll just do it manually like this.
Yeah, you're not going to want to take
I don't want to take too much, yeah. I just want to clean it up, give a better surface for epoxy. You can see where it's high in the middle?
Yeah.
Now, on this, all you really need to do is very carefully take
a file and
a bastard file, works better, and just very carefully clean up the routing on the insert. For those of you who are more adventurous, you can use a Dremel if you're careful with some sort of grinding attachment.
Well, I knew we weren't going to get through a Persimmon restoration without the Dremel at some point.
Good tool to have. Now we're ready to epoxy and set our insert again. We can feel it generally to feel if it's fairly smooth. It's a little high still, but that's okay. We'll take it down with some sandpaper.
We've got this club deconstructed. We've got the plate off. We've got the insert out. We got the shaft out, and now it's time to put it back together. So what do you do? What do you do here now, Mike?
Well, the first thing we're going to do here, we're going to clean this cavity out pretty well, and we're going to clean the insert. I think we did some of that in the previous session, didn't we?
We did. We did. Yeah.
So we've got that ready. So what happens now? I'm going to put the head in the vise. We're going to look at our old back screws. These were cut through, so I think it makes sense to try and put new screws in.
Yep. A club like this, we want the best.
The investment I've made is in different size screws.
Look at that.
They're available in boxes. They're available in plastic, different sizes. You can get them pretty much any time at any good Ace Hardware. So looking at this screw, the closest we're going to come to this one is probably this 4x1/2. We might have to go up a little bit. We'll see if this one works. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to abandon these old screws. We'll take a look. We'll do a dry fit and see if this screw goes in easily, but not too easily.
Well, it looks pretty good. It went in there pretty nice, didn't it?
Yep, so those will work fine. So we've checked that, we've done a dry fit.
Okay, so we're getting ready to epoxy the insert in and the sole plate.
This is an epoxy I've found to be economical and very useful for basic epoxy work. You don't want to use it for shafting. Maybe a putter, but not for any woods or irons. It's not strong enough. But it works well as far as impact on small face repairs and I'm putting inserts in and for waterproofing sole plates. It's perfectly acceptable for that.
It's good for working because it's quick setting, so that's going to
It's very quick setting.
In 20, 30 minutes, that's going to be
Yep,
set up.
and lets you work quickly, and it does
Right.
it does the job. I use it for waterproofing and for inserts of sole plates.
Okay, we're going to mix some epoxy.
I had some epoxy already open, so we'll use that. We're going to put some right on the face insert here. I'm going to put about a dime size
That's the
portion in there. We're going to use an equal amount of the black cap.
Resin and hardener. Equal resin and hardener.
Yep. You could mix it on a board or a piece of cardboard or something like that if you wanted to. It's not a
Mix it
problem.
right here. Use a toothpick.
This is the simplest way to do it. Don't worry about anything more stronger than that. That's really all you need. You want to get a good mix. We're going to work it up the sides, across the top. We're going to make sure a little bit gets into the screw holes. We'll leave a little on our toothpick because we may need to touch up the face a little. Slide the insert in, see that the grooves align. I like to do the top screw first. You may find it necessary to use a small countersink to clean out those screw holes. You don't need a lot, but sometimes that's useful. Line your screw up north and south. You don't want it sitting at an angle.
That's the classy way to do it.
Well, it's the proper way to do it. I'm going to put that down. Let's see, here's another screw. I like that top one first. I like to set that top gap. You don't want to over tighten them. You want to get them within maybe a quarter turn and then align it. And we'll double check those when we're done here. We get about 5 to 10 minutes to work with this epoxy. It starts hardening up fairly quickly.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's good.
Now at this point I'll clean this up just a little bit, and I'll use
Make sure you get some in the
a little
grooves there.
residue to make some has gotten into these grooves.
Yeah.
Use an old rag and I'll get it out of the stamping so that we don't have to worry about that later.
That's a great looking head.
693 is a beautiful head. I think it's my favorite. A lot of guys like the M85, but I like 693.
All right, so what do we got here?
Well, we've got the insert set, and I'm noticing as I'm looked that I've increased the depth just a little bit here on the cavity and left the insert a little bit high right in front. So I'm just very carefully going to take that insert down
Just a little bit, huh?
just a little bit.
like a
Yeah.
32nd of an inch maybe, huh?
Yeah. What I don't want to do is get into these routings here.
Okay, so we've decided we're going to add a little bit of weight to this club. So with the sole plate off, we're just going to drill in. How far are you going to go down here?
Well,
How much? What are we putting in here? About an ounce?
yeah.
We got about an ounce of lead that we're going to drop into this.
What I'm going to do is a little bit
We
unusual.
want this thing to sit right about 14 ounces.
I like to enlarge this cavity underneath so that it has a little bit of a lip and it won't come out. That lead won't.
So basically you're making it a little bit wider on the bottom than the top so that when you pour it in it's not going to...
Conical so that it doesn't
Right.
doesn't fall out.
Yeah, another good idea. Alright, so we're going to melt some lead.
This is an indispensable tool. You got to find a ladle. You can make one out of a spoon, but they get kind of hot. I would recommend you go on eBay and just look for lead ladles. Find one you like. You need about that size right there. And pick one up because they're very convenient. Now, lead is dangerous. It's a very toxic material. You really should wear some sort of dust respirator. When I'm working just a little bit, I tend not to. But you want to be careful with lead about breathing the fumes. Metal in the gaseous state is a fume. Just lightly peen it.
So when the lead's hot, you just kind of
Just not real hot. You didn't want it to be liquid, but before it really cools, and you'll set it down into the cavity.
Okay, well, one final thing.
I'll very carefully file any high edges off. So that our sole plate will seat. And I'm going to get rid of that little bit of epoxy that we had done prior, so that we get a good set on our sole plate. Do a dry fit. Oh yeah, we're looking pretty good now.
Pretty good there.
Yeah, we got it now. Put our tool away. If you can use the old screws, do so. But it's sometimes better just to use new ones.
So we're going to drop some new ones in.
So we're going to drop new ones in. Here's our famous Ace 5-minute. We're going to use a little more this time. We've got a little bit bigger area.
Yeah.
Maybe somewhere between a nickel and a dime. We try to avoid any gaps between the sole plate and the edge of the wood. If we get one, we can always go back and just do a little bit of epoxy later. My toothpick's still good, so we're just going to use it. I want to get on these edges.
And you like to get a little bit up on the side edges.
Yeah, what I'm really doing with this epoxy is holding the sole plate, but more importantly, it's helping waterproof the club so it won't change weight on you. Water is not your friend on a golf club, a wooden golf club. See, that covered that pretty well. We're just going to mix that. We're mixing as we go. We're going to try and work a little bit into the screw holes. You don't need a lot. You may want to get those screws out later, and you can always use heat, but we'll just move a little bit in there. Slide it back. Save your... We'll start our screws. Move that magnifier.
I feel like I'm in the dentist's chair with that magnifier.
It's a very useful tool when your eyes are not as good as they used to be. Especially when you're working on engravings. We're going to go one side and then counterclockwise. And we'll work the front two, second and third. It doesn't make a lot of difference. I just generally tighten them. Try to get them all set. Sole plate sometimes flexes a little bit. All right, now we're going to tighten them all up. Not over tight, just nice and snug. I could muscle more, but I don't. You can strip them out. You can strip the wood out, so you want to be just a little bit careful.
Put them in there firmly, but not too much.
Now we're going to look to see if we have any gaps where the epoxy didn't hit. And this is sometimes where I'll use this. I got a little bit right there, and I'll just try and spread just a little under that sole plate. I can always come back to this later if I have to. I want to make sure I don't get it up into the stampings, even though they're hard to see. We're going to bring those back, I think.
Right.
We'll clean this up a little bit right there. We got just about the right amount. Like I said, if you get a little bit of a gap later, you can always mix a little bit more up and just fill that in so it's nice and level. We'll see how it looks once we do the first sand on it. All right, your club is basically back together. Our next step, once this club dries thoroughly, and I've got to let it dry quite a bit now, because I want this epoxy good and hard before I start very carefully smoothing these screws down to fit flush with the sole plate. And if you don't let the epoxy dry, they'll move on you. So I probably won't do that for 24 hours or so.
Okay.
Okay?
We'll be back in 24 hours.
Cool, your head's back together.
Okay, so just to backtrack here a little bit, you're filing down these screw heads right
These
now.
new screws that we decided to use.
You're using starting with a coarse thread.
Yep, it's bastard thread, and then there's a finer bastard that we're going to use. So we're going to take as much material off as we can without getting into the sole plate or very far into it. On the back ones, you can kind of do two at once. You want to just look and test and see how you're doing. You can work the sole plate some too, but you don't want to obliterate the stampings.
Right, it's nice to keep those stampings.
It's better to leave a few nicks and marks in there than to obliterate the marks. It's just basic handwork, nothing fancy about it. We're going to switch over to the finer file. Trying to do a finish on these, blend them into the sole plate. You can take out minor marks in the sole plate while you're at it. And you can also pick up any epoxy that might have moved out of the gap. What you want to watch is that you don't get heavily into the stampings, because we're going to try and preserve those.
Preserve some of that stamping.
So I don't want to over sand those, or I don't want to file them. Bit of the finish. I'm doing this very lightly with as far as pressure goes.
So real light, just along the plate,
just along the seam, right? Trying to knock the epoxy back.
So we get a nice, clean, tight finish right along there.
You could wipe it down while it's wet, but sometimes that still leaves a little gap, a little valley, so I try to just leave it high and then take it down with a file or sandpaper. Now you could go to an even finer mill file for some cleanup work at the end. You see, I don't know if you can see it, John, there's a small dent right here.
A little dent right there, yeah, but we're not going
to try and take that out.
Yeah, that's okay. We got a 60-year-old golf club here. You can have a
older than that. It's probably 1950, 51.
Yeah.
67 years old. 66, 67 years old. It's almost as old as I am. Clean this up.
Okay, so now you're going to hit it with a little sandpaper.
This is.
What do we got here?
This is a 3M product. This one is
100?
Yeah, 100 grit. It's a little heavier than normal, but not too heavy. What happens with this is it wears down a little bit, and then it becomes a nice fine sandpaper finish.
Right.
Yeah, but for what we're doing right now, this helps us take the file marks out. You don't need power machinery to do this. It's nice, and I do have it, but you can do most of this work by hand.
Hand craftsmanship. Who would have thought? Boy, that sure makes a difference.
Selective pressure.
And that's usually the direction that you go, just up and down.
I go this direction rather than across, and I don't swirl on the sole plate. I want one pattern on it.
Just one straight
I can
pattern.
see this screw is still just a little bit high, so I'm going to take the mill file,
Give it a little bit more.
a little bit more dressing. Cold today.
Yeah, it's cold, isn't it? And there we go. That's looking pretty nice.
Now you can still see a little of the epoxy here and here, so we'll clean that up next. We have to do the same thing to the face. This time I won't go with the heavy duty file, I'll go with the medium bastard
medium.
file first. And I'll just start working these screws very lightly. I can catch that epoxy that's sticking up while I'm doing it.
You're just taking a little bit off to flush them out, but if you had to take those screws out in the future, for whatever reason, you still could.
Well, yes, but what you're going to need to do is use some heat,
Right.
because they're epoxied.
Because they're epoxied, right.
So what you would do is you have a screwdriver like this, and you won't really hurt it that much. You'll heat the tip up,
Put it in
very
there.
carefully apply it, let it sit for 30 seconds, and then you can probably use the same screwdriver to spin them out.
And then spin it out that way.
Yeah. They'll come out. What you have to be careful of when you put them in is that you have enough space so that you don't, brass screws will break. There's nothing more frustrating than putting that last twist on it and having it break on you, then you have to go in and drill it out. Sometimes put a dowel in there to give you fresh wood to screw into and re-drill the hole.
Right.
It can be done, it's just a pain in the neck. Now, we're at that point on this club where we're going to freshen up the grooves. I've got that handy dandy hand hacksaw that I've taken the teeth
Taking
off
the
of.
teeth off on the sides a little bit, so it's real thin.
I like to use this because my eyes aren't what they used to be, and I very carefully rescore the scoring lines. I do not, I repeat again, do not cut through the screws. You put the screws were never cut through on the McGregors. They were put in after the grooves were cut. So it doesn't make sense now to cut through them. So you cut up to them, or fairly close to them, and sometimes you use a pointed tool to do a final clean out on them, right up close. This takes a little practice. It's easy to get. You want to make sure that you don't get out of the groove if you can avoid it, because it's surprisingly hard to clean it up. Most of your epoxy is going to be on that line right there and that line there and a little bit up on top. Of course, we're not going to use this there.
Okay, so you really like to do as much of this work without the shaft
As I can. I do my stripping and sanding with the shaft in because it's easier to hold it in the vise. But I need to turn this head to get to these screws, and I can't really do that the way my vise is set up with the shaft in it. If I had an open bench I could, but I don't.
Right.
So I want to come in from this angle so that I can get up close on these screws here.
Right, so you can kind of keep moving the head
Yeah,
around
see
and
that one I
put
didn't.
those grooves in without having to deal with the shaft hitting the wall.
Exactly.
Yep, makes sense.
working this face a little bit.
Okay, so you like to sand it a little bit after you've
Yep,
worked on the grooves.
we're ready
got
for that.
And you just like to use that 100 grit sandpaper.
That's the major cut. I don't want anything heavier than that to cut with.
Yeah, that's a pretty good cut. And there we go. That's coming along.
Now, we've got a little bit of a chip on the toe of this,
Right,
but
so what are we
I
gonna do about
suspect that we can do one or two things. I can either put a little sacrificial piece in there, or we can see how it comes out when we do a light sand. I may be able to refine that line without altering the original aspects of the club too much. So if we don't have to put a chip in, we won't. We'll just see how it looks.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. So now, I've got a little tiny bit of, this is just a broken file I use because it's smaller.
Just clean out the front end of,
Clean out
that sole plate.
that little bit of that sole plate, a little epoxy sticking
A
through.
little epoxy on there, right?
Now, for those of you who have more space and are inclined to use power tools, I do have sanders over here.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about bulge and roll and how to set that up.
This is a radius gauge, and all it really is the circumference of either a 12, 14, 10, or 8-inch radius. Nothing more than 8 inches back to the center of the circle. This is 10. I like to use 10 and 12 for my bulge and roll. This one, we'll just see what we've got. This one's closer to 8, so that's got quite a bit on it.
Yeah.
In this direction, it's probably closer to 10.
Kind of a 10 and 8.
Yep. So 10 and 8. Of course, that's going to give us more gear effect.
Right, so if you come a little bit over the top and you hit it out on the toe, then that's going to help straighten that drive out for you a little bit.
So 8's not bad. I like 10, but that is a good looking club, and we'll take a little bit of that off as we work it down, but not a lot. I've got to work this toe a little bit, so we'll take just a little bit off. We'll get it somewhere between 8 and 10 inches.
Sounds good.
Gauges are fairly common. You could make this. It wouldn't be hard to make out of a piece of cardboard with and a protractor.
Mm-hmm.